week and probably next week too. But amongst all the frantic drama at Westminster, the would-be plots, the deadlines, the resignations, we need to keep one eye on what this is all about. The truth is, there is a logic to leaving the EU. We could choose to become a radically different country, lower taxes, less regulation, and there is a logic to staying, at least alongside, if we want to keep with the essentially social democratic European model we have followed for the last 45 years. Underneath the shouting, it's about which way Britain goes next. And maybe that is why everyone sounds so frantic. This morning, we're going to try and look at Theresa May's deal from different angles. We have the resigned former Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab. We have Labour in the shape of Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Attorney General, Shami Chakrabarti. And speaking for those parts of Britain who feel cut out of this Westminster drama, we have Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Now, the government decided not to put up a cabinet minister to speak to me this morning, but they offered the new Brexit minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, to review the news. He's alongside Polly Toynbee from The Guardian and Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. But first, the news with Tina Dahili.
Good morning. The Prime Minister has said that the next 7 days in the Brexit process will be critical for the country's future. Speaking this morning on Sky News, Theresa May confirmed that she will go to Brussels to talk to the EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. When asked about any internal challenge to her leadership, the Prime Minister said that as far as she was aware, 48 letters had not been submitted to the chair of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady. President Trump has visited Northern California to see the devastation caused by the worst ever wildfires in the state. This morning, officials said 5 more bodies have been recovered, bringing the total number of deaths to 76. Mr. Trump said the fires hadn't changed his views about climate change and said improvement to forest management would ensure that a blaze on such a scale did not happen again. Some of Britain's biggest companies are urging the government to honour a promise to give mental health in the workplace the same status as physical health. Executives from 50 companies have written to Theresa May asking her to follow through on last year's manifesto pledge to update health and safety legislation. The government says it will bring forward the recommendations of an independent review. President Trump has said the US will determine in the next 2 days who it thinks was behind the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. There have been reports that the CIA believes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the killing. Saudi Arabia has blamed rogue intelligence agents. The former Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab is accusing the Prime Minister of failing to stand up to a bullying European Union. Writing in the Sunday Times, Mr Raab, who resigned over the draft withdrawal agreement last week, said there'd been a lack of resolve with Brussels. He suggested Britain walk away from negotiations rather than be bullied. Theresa May has rejected suggestions that the agreement could be changed. Thousands of young people have found a unique way to make sure their climate change message is heard by trying to set a world record for the biggest postcard of all time. It's on a glacier high up in the Swiss Alps and features 125,000 drawings from children all over the world. It's urging governments to come together to help stop global temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks. What a morning. Very exciting for political obsessives, rather serious for the rest of you. There's the Sunday Times front page, stand up to the Brussels bullies. You heard about that in the BBC News. And there's lots and lots inside about the rivals sharpening their knives to go for Theresa May. We'll be talking about that in a moment. There's the Sunday Telegraph. The plot to oust May nears tipping point as MP's rebellion grows, and a slightly awkward-looking Michael Gove in his shorts standing outside his house. Much more of that inside as well. The Observer has Brussels telling Theresa May that if we delay this deal for much longer, it's going to cost us an extra 10 billion quid. The Mail on Sunday has gone page after page after page about the number of children changing gender in Britain's schools, and we may talk about that later on. But let's start with the story of the day. Now, Tom, everybody is wondering, we heard from the Prime Minister earlier on that she thinks the 48 letters that would start a leadership challenge aren't in yet. The question is, will they go in, do you think, next week?
Absolutely huge question, and let's face it, there's an awful lot going on in British politics this morning. There are a myriad of different hurdles the Prime Minister's going to have to get over in the next 10 days alone before she could even stand a chance of getting the deal in front of the House of Commons. The first one is still the biggest, which is, will her MPs try and topple her this week or not? Now, the crucial number count is going on at the moment. 2 more names in the Sunday Telegraph front page, probably put out there on purpose by the ERG, the Eurosceptic group, in their grid of trying to destabilise the Prime Minister, Zach Goldsmith and Bill Cash. That puts the official count of people declared up to 25. A private count going on by the likes of me at the moment puts it a little bit nearer 40. Because
but still well short of what they need.
Well short of 48, but who knows over the next couple of days.
And the stakes are very high here for the ERG and the Brexiteers as well, because if either they can't get the 48 letters, then they look all mouth and no trousers, uncertain trumpets.
Yeah.
If they do get the challenge, and Theresa May then wins it, she's Prime Minister, she's secure for another year, so they've got to watch themselves.
Well, this is the thing, there was a feeling now that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Steve Baker, who lead the ERG, slightly jumped a bit early on Thursday. They declared a cavalry charge without seeing how many horses they quite had behind them, if you like. But if this contest goes ahead, and I think there is a likelihood that probably will be a confidence vote in her, not a leadership contest, a confidence vote in her, again, that itself will hugely change the dynamic, depending on how many people vote for her. So if, say, 120 or 130 Tory MPs vote for her, or against her, rather, she's in trouble. If only 50 or so does, then it strengthens her.
Tory MP who's not going to put in a letter, I suspect.
I've been following this story for months, and actually every week we've had breathless stories about the 48 letters. They haven't materialised. And the thing that strikes me is that I don't see really the point of it. A new leader, if we were to get one, would not change the parliamentary arithmetic. That would not change. And it would be very unlikely, almost impossible, for them to reopen the negotiation. So it's a futile distraction, frankly. I think we need to focus on getting and landing the deal.
Now that you're a minister in the Brexit department, what you make of stories that there are 5 members of the cabinet trying to get together, negotiate, to renegotiate aspects of this deal. Is it not too late to do that?
Well, my understanding is that, and I've only been in post 40 hours, is that the deal is what it is. I think it's a strong deal. I think it delivers on the 3 things that the Prime Minister talked about, on the money, on freedom of movement, and also on that the ECJ will not be supreme in our country anymore. So that's a really good deal, a strong deal.
The reason I'm confused is that the Prime Minister is going back to Brussels in this coming week to talk to Mr Juncker and others, and people are wondering, is she then going to try and tweak or renegotiate the deal that we have seen so far?
I think there are final tweaks to be done in terms of the final agreement. So that's when we get into the implementation or the transition period. But I think substantially the deal is almost complete. I think it's a strong deal, as I've said, and I look forward to defending it in the House of Commons.
Lots and lots of comments about the week across the papers. One really interesting question we still haven't had a complete answer to. What did the Prime Minister mean when she said this crisis could stop Brexit happening at all?
I think that one of the problems we've got is that people destroyed the deal. They ripped it apart before they'd even read it. I mean, I remember that there was, in the middle of last week, the Prime Minister launched the deal as a 5-hour cabinet discussion. Even before that had finished, people were saying how terrible the deal was.
But the clock is ticking. I mean, we're heading towards exit from the EU in March next year. So I'm still unsure what the Prime Minister meant when she said Brexit could be stopped.
The notion is that people who are opposed to the deal, let's say they're opposed to the deal for totally different reasons. There's an unholy alliance between people who want to stay in the EU for whatever reason, and people who think that the deal isn't strong enough. They have different
So the deal
motives.
falls, but they can't stop us leaving the EU.
I don't think they can. I think we're going to leave on the 30th of March.
Because there's a piece in, I don't know if you've seen it, in the Telegraph today where the Prime Minister was talking to Conservative associations about the deal, and she raised the possibility there of there being a vote in the House of Commons for a referendum. Is the government concerned that that could happen? That
I don't think there's any concern. Look, on the 30th of March, one thing is for certain, we will have left the EU. That's something that we're all very focused on. Now, in terms of the deal, I think if it were to be voted down. I don't think it will be. I think there's a very strong chance that it'll get through. But if it were to be, all that does is reopen the question and prolong uncertainty and chaos. And most
so
people,
Brexit can't be stopped?
It cannot be stopped. I'm quoting Jeremy Corbyn, in fact.
Perhaps for the first time.
He said that Brexit cannot be stopped, and I think he's right.
He didn't say that. He didn't say that today.
He didn't say that his mind on Sky News about half an hour ago.
I don't think it can be stopped.
He said Labour couldn't stop it on its own. What we are seeing, though, is a quite extraordinary disintegration of the Tory party. You see the extent to which Dominic Raab, who you're going to be interviewing, and the others are now setting upon May with an extraordinary savagery, accusing her of being weak, of having been bullied and browbeaten and bribed by Brussels. They're already kind of getting their victimhood in first, that who's going to be blamed when the whole thing's a disaster? Who is going to be blamed? Well, of course, Brussels will be to blame, and Theresa May will be
that's not a surprise.
to blame.
People are allowed to disagree.
But, he's saying walk away with no deal, which is amazingly rash stuff. And in fact, the one thing we know for certain is that there is a huge majority in the House of Commons against any suggestion of no deal.
You see, I think this is what a lot of people watching are concerned about. They can see all the things going on in the House of Commons, they know the clock is ticking, and they know we leave at the end of March next year.
Absolutely.
Unless there's some extraordinary events which stop that. But there aren't any, there's no evidence of that, which means that if we don't accept this withdrawal agreement, we may end up with no deal at all. By default.
I don't think that's been a possibility, with the greatest honesty, for about a year or so now, because since the general election, we had a House of Commons that is the one thing it's in favour of is stopping no deal. That's the only majority
can
of the Commons
do that?
afford.
Can it actually
stop no deal? Keir Starmer has a very interesting piece today, interesting story about Keir Starmer in the Observer saying that the one thing that he can do, that they think they can do, is to get through the House of Commons a commitment that under no circumstances will there be a no-deal crashing out. And that, of course, changes the nature of the game altogether, because Theresa May is trying to get her deal through, which nobody likes much, on the basis that the only alternative is no deal. Of course, there are other alternatives. There's a referendum, a people's vote. There are plenty of other alternatives. There's a Norway option, which Nick Bowles is putting forward. There are other choices.
Is one of the great sort of misnomers in politics.
We call it a second, another referendum.
As if the first referendum was not a people's vote. 33 million people voted in that, and that was a people's vote, and it had a decisive result. And our government's priority is to deliver that result.
Kwasi, the Prime Minister is quoted in the Sunday Telegraph today saying that it is possible that the House of Commons could vote for another referendum, and that in turn could stop Brexit happening.
I don't think another referendum is on the cards. I don't think there's enough time, and I don't think there's enough will. If you go out of the Westminster bubble, people, the one cry I hear all the time is just get this thing done.
Not what the polls are saying today.
Just get this thing done.
Today the polls are saying that there is a big majority of people who now say we want several of them.
Are they the polls that predicted that Remain would win?
Well, they're saying we want a final say. They weren't told what was going to happen. None of us knew what was going to happen. We didn't know what was on offer. Here now is the deal, this big, waiting to decide whether we want it or not. People want the choice, and I don't see why that's in any way a contradictory...
Meanwhile, we have this slightly strange situation in the papers where there's a very long interview with Dominic Raab in the Sunday Times, and his position is still that Theresa May must stay on. Meanwhile, in all the other papers, there's endless speculation about who's going to challenge her, which doesn't kind of quite fit. So it's Boris Johnson, David Davis, Dominic Raab, on it goes, Amber Rudd's mentioned as a possible runner. Pages and pages.
And I think as a great journalistic problem, we can't quite agree who's going to be, let alone the players themselves. And so you have the Sunday Express saying from the Eurosceptic wing it's going to be Boris versus DD. The Sun on Sunday says, no, it's going to be Boris versus Raab. And this is, I think, one of the greatest weaknesses. Oh, and by the way, there are also...
You can tell who they've all talked to,
or who their best contacts are. And there's also another sort of 5 or 6, the Jeremy Hunts, the Sajid Javis, even the Liz Trusses. And this is, I think, really sums up the problem of the opposition, the Rebel Alliance, is that they cannot pick a candidate. Steve Baker was on the telly on Friday, fascinating, saying, well, we'll have to pick a rebel candidate, and we may even have to go into a room and draw lots for it.
Well, still, they haven't even got an alternative plan. We don't want this plan, but they haven't got a plan of their own.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a complete futile
Let's talk a little bit about Dominic Raab, because he is the guy who started all of this avalanche at the beginning of the week. He's all over the Sunday Times, as I've said, and this seems to have put him in pole position as the person to challenge Theresa May in due course, certainly in the minds of many Brexiteers.
Well, that's this week's story. Every week there's a new person in pole position, and it's him now because he's the most recent of the 24 people who've resigned in the 18 months since Theresa May has been Prime Minister. It's been the most extraordinary spectacle. But he's the man in the front now, and he's the one putting forward the tough, we want no deal, we want to cut taxes, we want to be Singapore on Thames, rather like you wrote in Britannia Unchained.
Well, thank you for plugging my book. Thank you.
Well, indeed, the idea of cutting welfare.
Booksellers.
This is the hard right position he's taken, and of course it has, you know.
And as I was saying at the top of the program, that is the choice really we face as a country. It is two different directions economically. One outside the EU going in the direction that you've been talking about, cutting taxes and regulations, and the other one staying as a social democratic state.
I think
that is the choice.
I think what you've done is a very journalistic thing of putting a binary choice. I don't think that's on the cards. I think what we want to do...
That is what we do.
That's what you do. It simplifies things. But actually, in terms of the deal, what the deal does, in reality, is deliver on the money, it delivers on the laws, having our own laws here, and the freedom of movement. I need to stress that because people seem not to appreciate that the deal is actually a strong deal.
Let me give you another binary choice. All the papers having a go at the Prime Minister and the paper not having a go at the Prime Minister, which is the Mail on Sunday. A very well written, I have to say, leader piece in her defence.
It's a very strong and long, dare I say it, op-ed. And it basically says what I've been trying to say this morning, is that a new leader isn't going to change the dynamics of this thing. We're nearly at the end of the negotiation. When we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, we're going to leave the EU on the 30th of March, which is barely 4.5 months away. And having a new leader is not going to reopen the negotiation, nor will it change the parliamentary arithmetic. So it is a futile distraction. And I think what we have to do is focus on landing the deal and moving forward.
Dominic Raab. Your paper takes a somewhat different view, I think it's fair to say, in its leader today.
Yeah, we're not overly happy with the deal, though, interestingly, actually, if you look who hasn't ruled out backing it, the Sun newspaper, certainly the Daily Mail, the DUP, there's a huge amount of people actually still out there who haven't committed to
but haven't finally closed the door.
Exactly, and I think this is why the Prime Minister's point on Sky News just now is interesting. The negotiation for the withdrawal agreement, the backstop, is closed. So you have the Gang of Five, and there's a tremendously rude cartoon in the Sunday Telegraph this morning.
Go on, show us that.
Which shows the Gang of Five rowing themselves back to Brussels. This is, go...
Like a favourite five,
etc.
Five.
They're not going to achieve anything, I think, on trying to renegotiate the backstop. But it's the future framework, the political declaration. It's only 7 pages long. That's what's being negotiated. I think what the Prime Minister would try and do this week is say, well, look, forget all the backstop business. I've come up with a brilliant blueprint for a future deal, which is really worth getting through all that mess of transition and implementation and extensions to finally get to.
One non-Brexit directly related story at any rate, Polly Toynbee. In another week, we would have been talking at great length about the United Nations report on poverty in Britain. Some very, very strong, even inflammatory language by the rapporteur about child poverty in Britain in particular.
Indeed, the Telegraph had a piece about this shocking story about quite the depth of poverty in this country. The Sunday Times today has an example of this, where here is a girl who was born with CJD, born deaf and unable to speak, unable to walk, who is having her moving to universal credit, having it cut so drastically. She and her grandmother, who looks after her, will have to sell their bungalow. Absolute desperate plight of somebody moving on to universal credit, which has been such a disaster, and asked to go on a work capability assessment, and she can't speak or walk.
Kwasi, I'm sure you don't like being lectured by the United Nations, but this is genuinely shameful and embarrassing, isn't it?
I spent 18 months as the Chancellor's Parliamentary Private Secretary. I got to know the Treasury very well. I was involved in the last budget. If you look to the last budget, which was very, very well received, you could see the benefits of good and strong economic management. What we've done is we've managed to reduce the deficit. I know Polly doesn't like going on about it, but the actual economic framework in which this country is in is a very strong one.
These are the people who paid the price.
I don't know. I've read the story, and it's a sad story. But I think broadly, to think that Labour, with their policies of nationalisation, of getting the debt up to £1,000 billion, would
Did you think the UN report is appropriate?
Absurd. No, I don't know who this UN man is. I don't know where he's obviously come from the UN. I don't know what his particular background is. And he came up with a report. Now, poverty, the benefits, the difficulty that people have, that's absolutely something that we should be focusing on. But I think it's a total distortion to suggest that the government had somehow mismanaged the economy to the extent that this is a massive problem.
OK, enough for now. Thanks all very much indeed. And so to the weather, wonderfully cold and bright. A gorgeous November day in the south yesterday. But as in politics, the clouds are always gathering. Over to Matt Taylor in the Weather Centre.
Thanks, Andrew. And dare I say, an icy wind off Europe coming this week. But out there today, cracking autumn day. Blue skies from dawn to dusk for many. The mist and fog we've got at the moment in the Midlands, North East England will clear. Bit of patchy cloud on the eastern side of the Pennines, eastern Scotland throughout the day, but for most, sunshine throughout. Winds lightest in the north, gathering breeze in the south, but temperatures still above levels they should be for the time of year, maybe making around 13, 14 Celsius in the highlands of Scotland this afternoon. All that mild air across the far west extends into Iceland, where it's also 16 on the north coast. But compare that to Germany, 5 degrees this afternoon. That's more important to us because that is where air is coming from during the next 24 hours. Colder conditions set to push their way in. With it, tonight we'll see increasing amounts of cloud work into Scotland and through a good part of England. A few showers near eastern coast later on. Most though will be dry, clearest for longest in the west. So into Monday morning's rush hour, this is the most likely area to see a little bit of frost to start your day. Most though will be frost free, but a bit more cloud around on Monday. Some sunny spells breaking through every now and again, best of which always in the west. But across England in particular, we'll see a few rain showers here and there. Most will be dry, but temperatures down in single figures. And as we go into Tuesday, Andrew, more showers and an icy wind chill too. Back to you.
Well, after all, December is not long away. The Scottish Government, unlike Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists, want to stay inside a European customs union and single market. The SNP points out that the word Scotland doesn't appear once in the UK's negotiated agreement with the EU, and in response there have been growing calls in Scotland for a quick independence referendum there. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, joins us from Glasgow. Welcome, Nicola Sturgeon. Can I ask you, first of all, in today's papers, Tory MPs gaming what might happen next in the House of Commons include a scenario where the SNP's bloc of MPs abstains on the withdrawal agreement vote. Is that going to happen?
No, as things stand just now, the SNP MPs will vote against what is being put before the House of Commons, and let me set out very clearly why, but also set out clearly what I think should happen now. The withdrawal agreement, and I've ploughed through all 500 plus pages of it, has lots of flaws within it. But more fundamentally, there is no clarity whatsoever about the future relationship between the UK and the EU. So the House of Commons is going to be asked to effectively endorse a blindfold Brexit, where all the difficult issues that have dogged these negotiations for 2.5 years are simply kicked further down the road. I think it would be a mistake and deeply irresponsible for the House of Commons to endorse that. But it's not enough for people to say what they reject. There's now also a need for calm heads and clear thinking, and for those who reject this deal to come forward with the alternatives. And I think there are two ways forward. They're not mutually exclusive. Firstly, for the House of Commons to coalesce around a clear direction of travel that would keep the UK within the single market and the customs union, and also the option of another vote, because whatever people voted for in 2016, they did not vote for the chaos that is prevailing now. And I hope to be in London later this week, and I think it is incumbent on opposition parties to come together to look at a clear alternative that is in the interest of people the length and breadth of the UK.
Well, I want to look at those alternatives closely in a moment, but before I do, just let me ask you a little bit about the deal you say is no good for Scotland, because it includes, and I'm quoting from it, a free trade area combining deep regulatory and customs cooperation going ahead, zero tariffs, no fees or charges, no restrictions across goods sectors. A lot of what is in this is exactly what the SNP wants, isn't it?
Well, no, we want us to unequivocally remain within the single market and the customs union, and nothing in the withdrawal agreement or in the sketchy 7 pages about the future relationship commits to that. That's one of the strategic mistakes I think the Prime Minister is making. She's allowing her opponents on the hard right Brexiteer wing of her party to say that she's effectively keeping the UK in the single market and the customs union, but she's not actually doing that, so she doesn't get any of the benefits of the clarity and certainty that would bring. And because there is no clarity, it is likely, as things stand, that the withdrawal agreement provisions on backstop or extending the transition would kick in. And of course, while I absolutely support whatever arrangements it takes to preserve peace in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, that would put Scotland at a real competitive disadvantage with Northern Ireland, which is another reason why I couldn't support it.
Nonetheless, here it is. 580-odd pages, and I also have gone through a strange lack of verbs in it. The real question is, if this is voted down with the help of the SNP in the House of Commons, what happens next?
Well, that's
because
what
the clock
I've been trying to set out.
Sure, the clock keeps ticking.
Absolutely.
Now, you say MPs could vote for an alternative way forward, but that requires somehow trying to force the Prime Minister to go back and renegotiate something that Angela Merkel, for instance, says cannot be renegotiated now.
Well,
we're putting her in
firstly,
an impossible position.
Well, no, I don't think that's the case. You know, this is a Prime Minister who spent the last 2.5 years saying that no deal is better than a bad deal, who's now trying to tell people that a bad deal is essential to avoid no deal. The House of Commons should not allow itself to be placed in that fire or frying pan position.
If I'm sitting at home and I'm really worried about, I've listened to people like yourself and many others talk about no deal being catastrophic, and I'm really worried about that, and I know the clock is ticking. And I also know that you can't simply pass a motion in the House of Commons to stop this happening. I'm beginning to be worried that if you vote this down, you will not have any alternative. You may not want a no deal, but you may not have any alternative to that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to set out what I think should happen, because absolutely people are worried about this. So, you know, I understand, and I think it is perfectly understandable for most people, why the EU 27 would not want to get into an endless renegotiation of the deal that is on the table just now. But if there is a different direction, if the House of Commons says, look, we want to go down the road of single market customs union membership, we want more time to take this back to the people of the UK in another vote, we need an extension of Article 50. If there is a clear change of direction, then I believe the EU 27 would be prepared to look at that. But that means those who don't want this deal coming together. And there is a responsibility on people like me. I'm not in the House of Commons, but on behalf of my party and those in the House of Commons now, to have calm heads, clear thinking, and to take that responsibility seriously and to work together.
Looking at statements you've made, the specifics of this deal, I haven't completely given up on it yet. You say, my party is on record that we should come out of the Commons fisheries policy. The Commons fisheries policy is not fair to Scottish fishermen. Now, Theresa May has negotiated to leave the Commons fisheries policy. By doing this, are you not letting down Scottish fishermen?
No, absolutely. I think if you read that withdrawal agreement and the sketchy outline of the future relationship, what we're seeing is a UK government preparing to sell out Scottish fishermen with the talk of an agreement that would secure access of other countries to Scottish waters. But let me address the point from the SNP perspective. We've been long-standing critics of the CFP. We've argued for reforms of the CFP and would continue to do that if we were to continue to be in the European Union. But of course, the compromise option that I've been arguing now for the last 2.5 years of single market customs union, what in shorthand terms would be called the Norway option, would not involve the UK going back into the common fisheries policy. The problem here is that the compromise options that people like me, and you know, I would rather we were staying in the EU, have put forward, have been ignored by the Prime Minister. And you know, the Scottish Government's been ignored, our Scottish Parliament's been ignored, we've been sidelined, the powers of our Parliament have been diluted over these past 2.5 years. It's time for the Prime Minister to start to listen, and it's time for those of us who think she's taking this in the wrong direction to exercise our responsibility and come up with a better plan. What we can't have are these people in the Tories that have no plan but just want to shout loudly about everything that everybody else is doing wrong.
Let me ask you about your plans. One of them, you say, is another referendum on the whole business, in effect trying to reverse Brexit. What do you think the questions would be in that case?
Well, I think it could be, if we get a single market customs union, people could be given the choice of whether they prefer that or to stay in the European Union. I concede there has to be a discussion about what the the option of remain in the EU, in my view, if you're going to ask people again, would absolutely have to be on that ballot paper. But I recognise there would be a discussion that has to be had. That's what I'm saying here. Those who don't think that the Prime Minister's deal is the right way to go have now a responsibility to come together and coalesce around an alternative. And I'm happy to play my part in that, and I will seek to have discussions this week with other parties to get us into that position. I listened to Jeremy Corbyn.
Another possibility, much talked about, is another general election In the view of the SNP, is that likely? Are you preparing for it?
I'd love to have another general election to allow people to get rid of this shambles of a Tory government, the most dysfunctional, incompetent Tory government in my lifetime. And, you know, I, like the rest of most of the rest of the people watching, lived through the Thatcher years. So I would love to think that we could get a general election, but the Fixed Term Parliaments Act make that difficult to secure. We've got to have all options, and we've got to exercise our responsibility to come forward with alternatives.
So we've talked about a possible further Brexit referendum, we've talked about a possible further general election. The last time that we were talking about this, I asked you about another Scottish independence referendum, and you said you'd have to wait till you'd seen the withdrawal agreement. You have now seen it. You just said you've read all 580 pages of it. Now you've seen it, what are you going to do?
Well, I think it's firstly appropriate to wait and see what the House of Commons does. This withdrawal agreement, as things stand just now, is not getting the approval of the House of Commons. Wait until the dust settles. I will come forward with my views on what I think are the appropriate next steps for Scotland specifically in the not too distant future, but I think it's reasonable to allow the dust to settle. We could be facing another general election, we could be facing another Brexit vote, but one thing is beyond any doubt: the implications, the consequences of Scotland not being independent have been very stark in the last few months, and particularly in the last week. Scotland's interests have been sidelined, our Parliament has been ignored, our interests have been disregarded.
When are you going to have the guts to actually say, and so therefore we're going to have another independence referendum?
Well, I'll come on and talk to you, Andrew, about that as soon as I make that statement, but that will be in the not too distant future. But, you know, we have chaos reigning at Westminster just now, and I think in the
context of that chaos, are you talking to Jeremy Corbyn about the way forward?
I'm keen to talk to Jeremy Corbyn and whoever in the House of Commons. As I said, who knows what will be unfolding in the House of Commons this week, but I hope to be in London later this week. I hope to be in the Commons. I would be happy to sit down with Jeremy Corbyn. I listened to him on another channel earlier this morning, and there's still an absence of leadership there, an absence of Jeremy Corbyn actually saying what he would do differently. So if I can help to get Labour into a position where we can coalesce, I would be delighted to try to do that, and I hope to have these discussions with Labour and with others over the course of this week.
OK. Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. The future of Theresa May and her agreement may well depend upon the consciences of individual Labour MPs. How many eventually decide that avoiding a no-deal exit is more important than staying to do one to the government? Shami Chakrabarti is a close ally of Jeremy Corbyn and is his Shadow Attorney General, and she's with me now. Welcome, Shami Chakrabarti. Can Brexit be stopped?
Mrs May's deal is unacceptable. I think we have to
My question is, can Brexit be stopped?
Well, theoretically, but we're a long way from that moment because, of course, 52% of the country voted for Brexit. They certainly didn't vote for this. What's important is that Parliament does its duty and realises that this deal is the worst kind of bureaucratic fudge that doesn't deliver for anyone, for those who voted for Brexit, those who voted for Remain, and in particular for jobs and services and the economy of this country.
Shami Chakrabarti, would you like to leave the EU?
I campaigned to remain in the EU. Everybody knows that.
Do you still want to stay in the EU?
I respect the outcome of the referendum, but I don't respect this bodged deal. I cannot support it, and I cannot advise my colleagues to support it. It doesn't meet Labour's tests. It doesn't live up to Theresa May's own promises. It's the worst of all worlds. I have no doubt about that.
And you prefer to see no deal than vote for this?
No. We're not going to have no deal because we will work. Jeremy Corbyn was very clear on Sophie Ridge's show on the other channel that we will...
He wasn't clear about how he's going to stop it, how any of you can. You say you want to.
Absolutely.
I still don't understand exactly what you do to stop it.
What I believe will happen is that, for the moment, we're asking Theresa May, and by the way, it seems that 5 of her pizza plotters in her cabinet are asking her to go and renegotiate this deal, I suspect in a different direction to that which I would like to see. But we're asking Theresa May now, while there's still time, to go back to the EU and negotiate something more in line with our 6 tests. If she doesn't do that and she brings this deal to the House of Commons, then I believe it's looking like this will be voted down.
So it's voted down.
If it's voted down.
But you see, you then put down, for instance, a motion in the House of Commons to say that we don't want no deal, or you put down a motion to say we want something else. But motions are not, as you know, legally, and this is legislation.
So it's my view that if Theresa May doesn't think again now while she's still got time, and this deal is voted down, that is of enormous constitutional significance, and normally in a parliamentary democracy she ought to go to the country. She ought to say, this is my deal. All these terrible blackguards in the House of Commons have gone with the highway and not with my way. Back me or sack me. She should call a general election. Now,
I'll come on to that in a moment.
Well, no, but you asked me what's going to happen and what I would like to see. I would like to see that. Now, if that for any reason is not possible...
It's not possible, is it?
Well... I feel rather differently about it. I think it's perfectly possible because she could say back me or sack me, or alternatively, if the shenanigans continue in her own party and there are attempts to replace her, it seems to me completely unacceptable for the Conservatives to crown a second unelected Prime Minister without a general election.
But all this depends upon Tory MPs at a time when Labour is ahead in the opinion polls voting for a general election. And in terms of the two-thirds majority, you need about 100 Tory MPs to decide to vote for Christmas. That's why I think it's not going to happen.
It depends what they want. I suspect...
They don't want to lose their seats.
Well...
Most of them.
Well, perhaps they're confident. Perhaps they're confident in their own abilities, and perhaps the putative leaders are. My experience.
Okay, I'm going to give you this. I'm going to say you've got your election and you win your election. Okay, in your manifesto, presumably you stick with the 6 tests at this stage, and you become a party determined to enact Brexit. Is that right?
Well, I mean, what we are currently trying to achieve is the closest possible relationship with the European Union, a permanent customs union.
While being outside it.
Well, a permanent customs union, a relationship with the single market that protects industry and service industries in particular, but also allows us to invest, allows state intervention to invest in the regions and nations of this country.
Is this not remarkably close to the transitional or implementation agreement that Theresa May has negotiated?
No, because we would have a say, for example, over future trade deals.
Well, the EU says again and again that is completely impossible. That is only if you are a member of the EU. They've said it again and again. Angela Merkel, all of them have said you can't have all the privileges unless you're a member.
We would have a completely different atmosphere in any negotiations conducted by us. Why? Because, not least because we want to stay in line with workers' rights, environmental protections and consumer protections.
Well, a lot of that is in here, a level playing field.
No, it isn't actually.
A level playing field.
But we're not talking about a level playing field and no regression for now. We're talking about staying in line with progress in the future. Under this arrangement, workers' rights, consumer environmental protections would over time decline in Britain.
You wouldn't be able to strike new trade deals under that circumstances. And again, whatever the atmosphere is, I mean, you may think we're nice and we're Labour, they'll be nice to us.
You're citing this deal to me, and I'm telling you that I'm not buying it, and I don't think the House of Commons is buying it because it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to all sides, to Leavers, to Remainers.
Have you read it?
Yes, I have actually, but I'm sure you have too.
I've read an awful lot of it, yeah.
Well, I've read it all. Thank you.
So you say it's unacceptable,
yes,
even though it includes lots of things the Labour Party has said.
It doesn't. I mean, this is the problem with it, if you'll forgive me, Andrew. The problem with it is that it's machine politics. It's kicking the can down the road. It's designed to look as if it can please everybody, and it can't. And the problem is that it contains no vision, no clear vision for what Britain is going to be in the future. And if there's any hint, it's in the fact that there'll be no regression from workers' rights as they are now, but there certainly won't be continued progress in line with the European Union in the future.
Because we're not members.
No, but we believe in the same values and standards.
I can't understand why you want to leave the EU.
I don't want to leave the EU. I campaign to
remain.
But
you're going to go into a general election campaign as a member of a party whose manifesto says we are leaving the EU. We are
I'm
EU
a Democrat. I don't know about you.
Enablers.
I don't know about you, Andrew, but I'm a Democrat.
Don't try and patronise me. I'm as much a Democrat as you are.
I certainly wouldn't try to patronise you.
Anyway,
I'm sure you would never try and patronise me.
Neither way. Let me read you what Lisa Nandy says, Labour MP. Having a UK-wide customs arrangement would be a really big piece of the jigsaw for Labour and something that we ought to consider. That is what is here.
I am
not forever, but for foreseeable future.
I'm not satisfied with the protections in that document. In particular, I'm not satisfied that it protects workers' rights, environmental and consumer protections.
You've spent most of your career being in favour of free speech and human rights and all of that. You've got lots of Labour MPs who look at the possibility of no deal and are so worried about it that they are contemplating voting with the government and voting for the withdrawal agreement. What do you say to them?
I say that's not the choice. We can work together. We heard some very big hints, for example, from Nicola Sturgeon a few moments ago. If we vote down this desperately unattractive deal, we can work together across parties, and I've also done that all of my career, by the way. We can work together across parties to make sure that there is another alternative, which is a jobs first arrangement, the closest possible partnership with the European Union that safeguards, yes, business and industry, but also environmental, consumer and worker rights.
Well, we can agree it's a pretty thumping document. Are you really saying you can renegotiate that within a matter of weeks?
Size isn't everything.
You can renegotiate that in time for our leaving the EU in March?
I believe that
Really?
if Theresa May acts now and acts in the areas of particular concern, there is still time to renegotiate this. The question is she going to listen? And of course, there are 5 members of her own cabinet, those that are left, who are urging her to renegotiate as well. So I'm not alone in this view.
But we've also heard Angela Merkel and many more saying it's too late, it can't be done.
Well, you know, this is what people say in times of negotiation. The EU has ample form for renegotiating, as with Lisbon, at the last minute. So I'm confident that if there's real will, and if Theresa May listens, she listens to people on all sides who are unhappy with this terrible deal that, I mean, not least, that locks us into a halfway house in which we have no say. If she listens, there's still time to save this.
All right, Shami Chakrabarti, thanks for talking to us. Now look at what's coming up on the Sunday Politics, where you are straight after this programme.
In London this week, what the Prime Minister's deal means for London, should it be passed by Parliament, and how might the capital cope with a no-deal scenario? And with the latest proposed shake-up in London's bus network mean routes being cut in inner London, but more buses in the burbs.
Here on BBC One.
Dominic Raab's resignation this week was the single most dramatic moment of all, but it was odd. He resigned in protest at what he sees as the awfulness of an agreement he himself had apparently negotiated. Rum business. He joins me now. Who negotiated this, Dominic Raab?
It was a team effort, and I came in July. A lot of work had been done before. It's a mixture of the Cabinet, me as Brexit Secretary and David Davis before. We deputised for the Prime Minister.
But it is your deal, and you resigned over it.
And actually,
weird.
I think we got very close to a deal that would be faithful to the referendum, sensible and pragmatic. Remember, I took up this post after the Chequers announcement, which was already very controversial. I want to make a success of this. But 2 or 3 of the changes, as I set out in my resignation letter, I'm afraid rendered this deal fatally flawed. And in good conscience, when you think about the long-term good of this country economically, democratically, when I look my kids in the eye and I think, what will this country be like in 10 years? I didn't feel able to sign up to this.
Does this deal mean that we leave the EU, in your view?
Notionally, yes. But, for example, I think it takes a very predatory approach to Northern Ireland. If you look at it, the analysis is the Cabinet was told Northern Ireland will be treated as a third country for regulatory purposes. Don't think that's consistent with keeping the union together. The bridge...
So it threatens the union, in
Absolutely,
your view.
that was one thing. Secondly, the bridge from the end of the implementation period to the future relationship will be a combination of customs union and single market with no possibility to get out.
Well,
no democratic country in history has ever signed up to something like that. And then finally... Final point, and you've got it there. It's the outline future relationship, and bullet point 2 makes clear that far from the Chequers proposals or even a Canada-style arrangement, actually the permanent basis of our future relationship will be this customs union single market hybrid, debilitating for the economy, in my view, and also devastating...
That's the basis for going forward. Who authorised that?
And devastating for trust in our democracy, given the promises we made at the last election.
Who authorised that?
It's not clear to me. I've asked that question. It was a change made at the...
Well, if it wasn't you and you're the Brexit Secretary, paid to be the negotiator, the Brexit Secretary, it can only have been the Prime Minister.
Well, I don't know. I asked that question in Cabinet and I haven't had a particularly good answer. It was described as a drafting change, but I think if you look at it, you've got it there in front of you. It is very clear that the future relationship will be based on this combination of basically the backstop.
Build on the single customs territory provided for in the protocol, is what it says.
Exactly.
And that must have been negotiated by the Prime Minister. There's nobody else who could have done it.
I don't know the answer to the question. I don't impute bad faith to anyone. I just cannot sign up to that because it is a clear breach of the promise every Conservative went into the last election with.
Now, the Prime Minister's office says that if you look at the way out of this customs backstop area, there is a way out for Britain. It's complicated. There's negotiations. There's good faith in both cases. There's lots of legal language. But we do have a way out.
Now, that's not correct, and that's not, in fact, what the Cabinet was told. There is a possibility to get out, but the EU has a veto over it. So we would be signing up to accept rules and laws made by the other EU member states with no regard for the UK's circumstances, from economic policy to social policy, and we'd have no way out. No democratic country in history has signed up for that.
So we'd be stuck inside this arrangement, and then presumably the EU would be able to do whatever it wanted with us.
Well,
in terms of asking for more money.
The argument is made, let's get this over the line and play for the second half, the future relationship negotiations. But precisely because of what you've just shown there, it would tilt the advantage in favour of the EU and prejudice, frankly, taint the second phase of negotiations. So I think it is a fatal flaw. And the shame of it is, I have to say, I've supported this Prime Minister all the way through her premiership. I still do now.
Really?
Yes, but let me explain. We were close to a deal. And actually, if these 2 or 3 points were changed, I still think a deal could be done. But it's very late in the day now, and we need to change course.
Do you think she's going back to try to do that?
Well, I don't know, and the reason I resigned was it was clear to me that Cabinet had decided to accept the deal that she'd proposed, and I was being asked to go and sign on the dotted line with Michel Barnier, and I just didn't feel in good conscience I could do that. But I support this Prime Minister. I want her to succeed, but I do think we need to change course. Okay. Otherwise, we'll regret it for the foreseeable future.
Is this deal worth 40 billion quid?
No.
So we've got a deal which is not worth 40 billion quid, which you said this morning we've been bullied by the European Union, and you've said this morning that that's because the Prime Minister lacks political resolve and will.
Well, I think actually the government as a whole, we were very clear in the course.
But she leads it.
No, sure, and I take my responsibility. And we're a cabinet as well. We have a system of cabinet government. But I do think we're being bullied. I do think we are being subject to what is pretty close to blackmail, frankly, for your viewers at home. And I do think there is a point at which it probably should have been done before, where we just say, I'm sorry, this is the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland. We cannot accept those dictated terms.
So whose political will and resolve was lacking?
Oh, the government as a whole. But ultimately, of course,
the Prime Minister, surely.
I've been arguing with the Prime Minister for a while that actually we need to say that there's a line in the sand beyond which we wouldn't move. But I've got...
To quote your ally, Boris Johnson, you're trying to have your cake and eat it, aren't you? You've actually made a devastating attack on the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. You have resigned from the government, triggering a political crisis. And now you're saying you support the Prime Minister, who doesn't have the will and resolve to carry on and negotiate this. It's a pretty weird position to be in, is it not?
Well, in fairness, you say Boris Johnson is my ally. He's a friend and a good colleague, but he's not an ally. I'm supporting this Prime Minister. But the truth is, people expect their politicians to be able to be true to their convictions and to be honest. I couldn't, in good faith, for the reasons I set out in my resignation letter and that we've gone over, sign this country, the country I love, up to that deal.
Neither of us know at this stage whether there's 48 letters in for a leadership challenge. If there are, will you back the Prime Minister against that?
Absolutely.
And under any circumstances, you would never stand against... stand for the Tory leadership in these circumstances.
So first of all,
you'd back her all the way through.
I would back her. I would never, in these circumstances, send the letter into the 1922 committee. Don't think that's right. I also think all of this leadership stuff is a total distraction from the historic moment that we're at, which is to get this deal over the line. I believe it is salvageable, but on its terms as it's currently presented, it is clearly damaging economically, but also in terms of our democratic control. Remember, there are some things this deal would do in terms of take back control over immigration policy and we wouldn't pay the vast contributions to the EU in terms of money. But the number one reason people voted to leave was to be master of our destiny, to take back democratic control over our laws. This will stop that from happening.
I, Dominic Raab, am not going to stand in a Tory leadership contest.
I'm not even getting sucked into all of that.
I want you to agree with that statement.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm supporting this Prime Minister. I will not be supporting anyone who is sending in letters to the 1922 committee. And in a vote of no confidence, I would support her.
You support her, even though you think she hasn't got the will and resolve to do this negotiation.
I'm saying I've got huge respect for her. Remember, in the 2017 election, I was a backbencher. I was defending her to the hilt. I've served under her as Justice Minister, Housing Minister and Brexit Secretary.
Okay.
I've always been loyal and professional, but also tried to behave with integrity. So I will support this Prime Minister and I want her to get this right. I think she can, but we must change course on Brexit.
All right, well, you've used emollient language just now, but Number 10 are not using emollient language about you. In fact, it's really, government source, it's a really unpleasant language. They says, we always called him, and that's you. We always called Dominic Raab the suicide bomber. Raab just went through the motions of carrying out the negotiations until it suited him to detonate.
Well, then why was I appointed in July?
Well, that's what they say about you now.
OK, well, look, I'm not getting into the name-calling business. As you've seen, I've been very careful. I like this Prime Minister and I respect her. And frankly, this silly, childish name-calling business, I never engage in it. But I do think we have a long-term decision for our country that will affect our children and theirs, and we've got to get it right. So I can't just somehow roll over on something which, for me, would be a breach of conscience.
Do you think this withdrawal agreement will get through the House of Commons?
No, and actually this is a really important point to make. I think the biggest risk of no deal, which I've always said we should seek and strive to avoid, is that a bad deal gets voted down by Parliament.
And would you vote against this if it comes to the House of Commons?
Yes.
You'll vote against it, and it'll go... The danger of that, as we've just been talking about all the way through the programme, is that does take us towards a no-deal entry, because it's hard to see. Do you think the House of Commons can avoid no deal if it votes this down?
Well, it's uncertain territory, but the risk of no deal goes up. I also think on no deal, we just need to be a bit clear about this. I've always said we should strive for a good deal. I think we can still get one over the line. And there are risks to no deal, and we ought to be more honest about them. But we also
Well, let's talk about no deal.
Sorry, can I just make the top line, then you can come in? We also need to be honest about the fact that actually, with will, with concerted effort, with real grip, and I've been looking at these plans that we've got in place since July, put out 106 technical notices. Actually, with resolve, we can mitigate some of the worst risks. But the real issue here is the short-term versus long-term. We would face some short-term disruption, but far better that than to put the long-term economic and democratic interests of the country at risk.
Well, to quote Matt Hancock, apparently, from the new Health Secretary from Cabinet, would people die? Can you guarantee that people would not die as a result of there being no deal?
Look, you can't...
That's what he said.
Well, look, so for example, on medicines, we've got a very clear set of contingency plannings to make sure that the stockpiling that we already do with the pharmaceutical industry is there.
But he apparently told you that he could not guarantee that people would not die.
Well, look, people are making all of these sort of, frankly, I think, slightly irresponsible statements.
Well,
there's lots of things
look,
if you don't widen the roads, you can't guarantee that road traffic accidents won't go up or down. But the fact is, this is a manageable problem. And I've looked at the plans...
You say it's a manageable problem. Let's try and imagine somebody who is a car worker in the West Midlands whose job depends on very fast, frictionless, just-in-time delivery of components up and down, and who's thinking about the head of Jaguar Land Rover, for instance, saying this would cost his company more than £1 billion, would be catastrophic. This is somebody who might well lose his job as a result of no deal. It's something he's been working for all his life. He loses his job. Lots of his colleagues do too. And you say it's a manageable thing.
Well, no,
on your shoulders and on your conscience, surely, is going to be the job losses that come about if we have no deal.
Oh, look, I think the risks are here on all courses that we take at this moment. And I agree that there will be risk, for example, if the EU takes, in a no-deal scenario, a punitive approach and tries to choke the border.
But you can't just blame them, can you?
No, but you've got to do two things. One, understand, is that really a club you want to throw yourself back into their arms? Or... over the long term, what would the effect of being tied to the EU with the approach it takes to regulation have on jobs? And I think that the risks are there short term. They can be managed. They can't be eliminated. But the far graver risks for our country are the long-term risks of a debilitating attachment to the EU.
Well, let's remind ourselves what the government itself says would be the effect on growth in the British economy of no deal. And it is, at the worst end of the thing, it's nearly an 8.7% shrinkage of the economy on your plan, on your proposal, because you are driving us closer towards no deal.
No.
You are,
First
by what you've done.
The head of the WTO has said that no deal wouldn't be a walk in the park, but it wouldn't be the end of the world either.
Minus 8%.
But I don't agree with those assumptions, and I've had quite... I've had quite...
They're government's assumptions.
But the Treasury and the various
and your
other...
own officials from your own department.
And I've challenged them over the last 2 or 3 months, because actually I think the factors that you plug into those assumptions obviously can make a big difference.
Okay.
And actually,
it's very hard for people to know who to believe, because the Chancellor told us, though, his figures, he agrees with them.
Well, of course, but look, the reality is, if we had real grip on the Borders Delivery Group to make sure that in relation to the border crossings, particularly Calais-Dover, we could reroute some of that trade as swiftly as possible, whether it's the Dutch or the Belgian ports that are really keen for that business. If we had a fiscal approach, so in the Treasury, a budgetary approach, which said, you know what, we'll put rocket boosters up the economy to see it through what I admit would be a difficult period. And if at the same time we took the money that we would otherwise be giving the EU and gave that support to businesses, we would see that through. And long term, we would be able to take advantage of the huge opportunities of leaving the EU, which have almost totally been eclipsed by the current narrative.
This is coming from somebody who caused enormous amusement and surprise around the place when you said this about the Calais-Dover crossing.
We are, and I hadn't quite understood the full extent of this, but if you look at the UK and you look at how we trade in goods, we're particularly reliant on the Dover-Calais crossing. And that's one of the reasons why, and there's been a lot of controversy about this, but one of the reasons why we've wanted to make sure that we have a specific and very proximate relationship with the EU to ensure frictionless trade at the border.
OK, that is kind of embarrassing, isn't it?
No, shock horror. Cabinet member takes on big job and says, actually, they've learned...
I hadn't realised how close Calais and Dover were.
No. What I said was I hadn't appreciated quite the full extent of not only the challenges, but also the solutions to it. So, to be honest with you, anyone that goes into you can have your laugh, Andrew. Anyone that goes into a big job, if they're serious and not arrogant or frankly ignorant about it, learns more. And what I've learned is, yes, for example, take food. We rely on 10% of our food to come through Dover, Calais. Now, that's a significant amount. That's a significant challenge. But actually, we've got 90% of food supply coming from other sources. So actually, that's the way you address the risk and make sure, yes, it's there, but you can manage it.
Let's return to what's likely to happen over the next few days or the next week or so. So this goes into the House of Commons in due course, and you say it's going to be voted down and you vote against it. It is suggested that what might then happen is we see the markets plunging, the pound plunging, a general sense of crisis and inside the Tory party, and it goes back to the House of Commons and is voted on again. Is that plausible?
I think it's very unlikely, but what's true to say is it would be very uncertain. And I think that the biggest risk of no deal is taking a bad deal to the House of Commons, because I think MPs will look at it and will examine all the costs and the risks and the pros and the cons in exactly the way you described and have to come to a judgment call.
We've had people from other parties suggesting that it is perfectly possible for the Commons to unite around another referendum and possibly even a general election in due course.
Well, look, the reality is Parliament can pass resolutions, but they wouldn't be legally binding. There's not the time to pass legislation to demand or direct the government to do any of those things. There's certainly not time enough to have legislation for a new referendum. So actually, we would end up in a no-deal scenario, which is why it's very important to take the action now which can mitigate, minimise or manage the risks.
All right. Among all the possibilities going forward, one that we don't know the answer to this is the 48 letters going in to challenge the Prime Minister. You said you would not write a letter yourself. What is your message this morning to those people sitting at home wondering whether to do that?
It's a total distraction from what we need to do. We need to get Brexit over the line. We need to support our Prime Minister. I've got huge respect for her. I wrote that in my resignation letter. It's not flim-flam. I've worked with her very closely on Brexit. And I think there's still the opportunity to get this right. Support the Prime Minister, but she must also listen and change course on Brexit.
And there are a group, we're told, of 5 cabinet ministers inside the cabinet at the moment trying to persuade her to change direction. She's going back to Brussels next week. She may indeed change direction. Are you talking to those people? Are you helping them?
Well, look, if anyone comes and wants to pick my brains, I'm happy for them to do it. I was obviously...
Have they?
Oh, of course. We've been talking over the last week intensely, and everyone wants to do the right thing and support the Prime Minister. The problem for me was...
So you're discussing with people like Andrea Leadsom possibility, even at this late stage, of tweaking the deal?
Well, we're not, I only resigned on Thursday morning, so I can't say I've had extensive conversations, but look, I'm willing to talk and be as constructive as I can. The difficulty for me is that I was being asked to go over to Brussels and sign on the dotted line with Michel Barnier on a deal which, as I said, in good conscience, I didn't feel was right for the country.
They've stayed inside the cabinet, and they might, the view from them might be that you ran away from the hard decisions, and they have stayed to try and keep the ship afloat.
Well, not one of them has said that to me, but of course, as I said, and that's why I answered the question before in the way that I did, I was being asked to go and sign...
Do you think they should resign?
Sorry, I was being asked to go and sign on the dotted line, and I couldn't agree to do that.
Dominic Raab, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. That's it for today. Thanks to all my guests. We'll be back here next week at 10 o'clock. But for now, goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my big show!
With big laughs, big stars,
Like dentist.
and of course, big surprises. Michael McIntyre's Big Show continues Saturday at 8:10 on BBC One.